Hello, this lecture is going to be on Chosun Korea. Now, I want to point out Chosun is similar to we talk about Ming China and Qing China. Chosun is a reference to the dynasty ruling. And one thing you'll note is that this dynasty lasted a really long time, right? 1392 to 1910, right? Over 500 years. That's pretty impressive. And I want to point out that's when people talk about sometimes how North Korea will fall soon. I'm always kind of like, well, the Koreans are really good at stability. So my guess is it's not anytime soon, but of course, who can tell? But in any case, looking there at Korea, notice that Korea is geographically in kind of a complex situation, right? It's got China to its north and west, Japan to its east, both countries that are larger than Korea, and could have theoretically taken it over, and yet Korea managed to maintain its independence and to develop its own distinct culture. So we need to talk a little bit about that, and particularly with Korea's relationship with China. And this image here is just a nice image of Korean traditional art, which I thought was very nice. But Korea had borrowed a lot from China. Korea had accepted Chinese Confucian culture. That meant Koreans had accepted Chinese style writing. They wrote in Chinese originally. They didn't have their own writing system initially. They accepted Confucian morality, which tends to focus on human relationships. They even adopted the exam system, though they did kind of make their own adjustments to it. And in addition, the Korean king accepted the Chinese emperor as his older brother and offered tribute. Now, I need to kind of unpack that. So it's important to note the Koreans did not have an emperor, they had a king. Remember, in the Chinese system, there's only one emperor, he's in China. The best you could be if you weren't the Chinese emperor was to be a king. And the Koreans were fine with that. They said, fine, we've got a king. We accept you as our emperor, and we will give you tribute, and you're our older brother. Now, one thing that's important to understand, remember in Confucianism, the idea is you have loyalty to the people, to the state, and benevolence to the people. So Confucianism is hierarchy. The people on bottom are supposed to serve the people on top, but the people on top are supposed to protect the people on bottom. So on one side, you may look at this and say, this is kind of weird that the Korean king would do this, but it makes a lot of sense. China is huge. So if you accept Confucian morality, and you accept the Chinese emperor as your older brother, that means that he has a duty to protect you. The older brother has to protect the younger brother. Sure, the younger brother has to obey and respect the older brother, but the older brother has to take care of and protect the younger brother. And you can't invade your younger brother. So this was a good idea from the Korean perspective. So if you take this together, the Chinese and Korean relations, it provides both with security, right? The Chinese were always worried about their northern border, and by having Koreans as their younger brother, that meant Korea was not going to invade China, was not going to help others invade China. That made sense. Of course, you can't invade your younger brother, so that helped protect the Koreans from Chinese invasions. I'm not saying that China never invaded, but it could have invaded and taken over had it wanted to, and it didn't, in part because of this idea. It also gave the Koreans access to this very advanced Chinese culture. And Chinese also loved reading Korean books as well, because remember, the Koreans wrote in Chinese. And they also engaged in a lot of trade with each other, which was mutually enriching. And it also gave legitimacy to both monarchs, right? Remember, the Chinese benefit when people give them tribute. It means that, people say, yeah, look, China's awesome. The Koreans are coming here to give gifts to the Chinese emperor. Chinese emperor must be doing a good job, so I should support the Chinese emperor. And of course, the Koreans knew that the Chinese emperor was kind of protecting them, and if they tried to overthrow their king, the Chinese might be upset about it and do something about it. So it did make the Korean kings look good because they were recognized by the Son of Heaven, right, the Chinese emperor. But one thing I want to emphasize, Korea was an independent state. It was not a Chinese colony. It was not a part of China. It's not a part of the Chinese Empire. Koreans had their own army and their own diplomats. And there were not Qing officials stationed in Korea, right? The Chinese did not have government officials in Korea telling them what to do. So while Korea did accept China as its younger brother, it still was an independent country, right? It still had its own foreign affairs and its own army. So Korea has a fascinating relationship with China, and it shows us how people could both borrow and stay independent. And in fact, the Koreans are really good at creatively borrowing from China and also developing independently. And you kind of think about this to give you an analogy. At the time of this recording, Korean pop music, especially BTS, is very popular. Right? Koreans are really good at making popular music that has worldwide acceptance. But a lot of that originated with American pop culture that the Koreans creatively borrowed and made it their own. And that's kind of what Korea's going to do with Chinese culture. So to give you an example of this, Koreans had borrowed Chinese writing, right? Koreans had borrowed Chinese writing. But Korean and Chinese are very, very different languages. I won't go into the grammar, but they're completely different grammatically. Koreans actually grammatically and Japanese are very similar, but Korean and Chinese are completely different. So that's, well, just to give you an example, in English, we go subject, verb, object. You know, I typed on the computer. But Koreans and Chinese would say the same thing. You would say in Chinese, I typed on the computer. But in Korean, you would say, I computer typed. The verb goes at the end of the sentence, not the middle like it does in English and Chinese. So very different languages. So there was a king, the only Korean king known as the Great, King Sejong, and he would have an alphabet called Hangul developed for Koreans. So this here is Chinese writing. This is the Korean, right? This is Korean here. And it's a phonetic alphabet similar to English. So this doesn't have any meaning. This is just a letter. Like this here means middle. This here means country. This is just a sound. This is like an N. This is an ah. This is like an R. This is like an ah. And this is pronounced T. So this would be nara. And that's what this is pronounced in Korean. This Chinese character would be pronounced this way. My point here is that King Sejong is going to have a Korean alphabet made so that Koreans can have their own written languages, because for like 1,000 years they've been writing in Chinese. On one side, this allows uneducated people to write. That was one of the purposes of it. Was one problem in Korea was the only way you could learn to write was to learn Chinese. So imagine speaking English in your home, but if you want to write something down, you have to write it in French. That would be difficult, right? And that's the situation Koreans were in. They had to speak Korean, but write in Chinese. So by developing their own alphabet, and it made it so that educated people would be able to write. But so in one sense, you have Koreans kind of emphasizing their own identity. But also, this allowed for the publication of books in Korean teaching Confucianism using examples from China. Right? So Koreans will develop their own alphabet to help spread ideas that originated in China, Confucianism, using Chinese examples. At the same time, increasingly Koreans would develop their own literary tradition. They would start writing their own novels in Korean. So this is what I mean. What I'm trying to get through here is that you can have these interesting relationships. You can have a big, powerful country like China and then a comparatively weaker country like Korea, but that doesn't mean that the Koreans just become like the Chinese. They borrow creatively, but then develop kind of their own ideas at the same time. They have a very dynamic relationship. Korea is not a part of China. It was connected to China culturally, but they developed their own way of doing things and maintained their independence. Now, that we've talked about China and Korea, we need to talk about something called the Imjin War, which is one of the most important wars that you probably have never heard of. We're going to talk about Japan later, but as kind of a spoiler, much of Japan had been united under a man named Toyotomi Hideyoshi by the late 16th century. And he decided that he wanted to conquer China, and the best way to get to China from Japan is to go through Korea. So Toyotomi Hideyoshi said to the Koreans, "Can I invade China through your country?" And the Koreans said, "That's our older brother. No, you can't." And so the Japanese will invade Korea to try and get at China. Now, one thing the Koreans will do, which is really astounding, is they'll develop these kind of turtle ships here. And that's literally what they're called in Korean, gobuksun, which means turtle ship. And they're called that because they had this very powerful hull with like spikes on their roofs, and they had this dragon head that had a cannon. You can see they had cannon. Well, you can't see it here, but these holes would have had cannons in them. And they developed these really technologically advanced ships that absolutely devastated the Japanese Navy. And then what would happen is the Japanese did have some initial success, but thanks to the powerful Korean Navy and thanks to a joint Korean-Chinese army, they were eventually able to defeat Japan and drive Japan out. And this is one reason why the Korean strategy of accepting China as their older brother was a really good idea because the Chinese had to come out and protect their younger brother and kick the Japanese out of Korea. Now, one thing I just want to emphasize about this war, right? It's important. The war is important on its own, but notice how this invasion led to the development of new technology, right? It was because of this invasion that the Koreans developed these turtle ships. So war naturally leads typically to developments in military technology. Right? War leads to developments in military technology. It sounds very basic, but here's what happens. After the Imjin War, East Asia is going to largely be at peace. There's a little bit of a flare-up when the Qing overthrow the Ming, but for the most part, for a couple hundred years, East Asia is going to be largely at peace. And that's a good thing, right? War kills a lot of people. So, and destroys a lot of property. So, and is not good for stability. So in many ways, this is good. But here's the problem. Because they had peace, their military technology is going to fall behind. Europeans are going to be constantly at war. So they develop really good technology. In East Asia, they're going to develop a way of keeping the peace after the Imjin invasion. And that means that their military technology will fall behind. Again, peace is good. People naturally desire peace. I don't want to get killed in a war. So on one side, we can say this is really good. But on the other side, we can see how peace is going to make it so that in East Asia, despite their technology, despite their advanced civilization, they're going to fall behind the West. And that will eventually lead, in part, to the West being able to almost colonize these three countries.